Hi, my name is Laura Burgoyne, and I'm excited to be joining together with my sister Connie Blackwood in the NOSA Unleashed podcast. Here, we want to expose the stigma surrounding mental health issues by illuminating and discussing real-life challenges and obstacles, keeping us paralyzed and fearful to move forward. Let us inspire you to believe there's more to life than what you're currently experiencing. You can rise from your despair and find hope for the future. It's time to end the silence, remove the stigma of mental health, and to pursue the path to purpose and fulfillment. We will do this together because no one stands alone. Welcome back to the NOSA Unleashed podcast. I'm Laura Burgoyne, and I'm glad to be here joined with my sister Connie Blackwood as we continue our conversations around topics that really matter, topics that impact our mental and emotional well-being. And I hope that you're finding benefit from listening to our podcast. Before we jump in today, I just want to let you know, actually, it's been a few weeks since we recorded a live podcast. And since that time, we've actually done a webinar and we've posted it live on YouTube and on our website. And it's called The Dividing Line. And it's about the same topic that we want to talk about today. It's about self-responsibility and where does that line, where do we put that line in our life? Where does our responsibility start and end? And so please go back and watch that webinar. It goes into greater depth and detail about this topic and brings a lot more clarity to how we develop that idea of self-responsibility in our life. And today, Connie and I want to talk about this topic, but more in a conversational style and how it's impacted us personally in our lives. So welcome to the conversation, Connie. I'm so glad that you're here.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
I absolutely loved our last webinar. I felt like it was so impactful and in a lot of ways revelational because we don't always think about responsibility. Like we kind of develop habits as children based on what we were taught, based on what was mimicked or displayed in our family relationships. And a lot of times we don't recognize times where we either take on too much responsibility, we take on the sense of ownership over other people's problems, or in a lot of cases, we don't see our responsibility in any of it and we try to blame it on others. And I think both of those are quite unhealthy and they lead to really bad habits and ways of actually operating in our lives. And so the whole goal in this chat, Connie, is just how do we recognize where our responsibility begins and others, or our responsibility ends and others begins, right? And so I know for myself, I've been impacted by this topic a lot because as a child, I felt like I was responsible for everything, the happiness of others, if anything went wrong in our family, I personally took responsibility for it, thinking that somehow I was at fault. How was your experience? Like, did you feel that same way?
Yeah, except I didn't put it on myself. Being the oldest, like a lot of times if something went wrong and I was watching you guys when mom and dad came back, it was my responsibility because I was watching you. And so no matter what went wrong and who was responsible, I was ultimately responsible. And I think taking that into my life, when I look over like blaming others or taking responsibility, I find that I lean towards taking responsibility way more often. And I think it has a huge part to do in the fact that that was put on me from such a young age, that everything was my responsibility. Even if I wasn't in the room at the time, even if it was like a conflict between two different siblings that I didn't even know about, it didn't matter. It was still my fault because I was the oldest. And so I think that just stayed with me. And so even in my adult life, I saw it in jobs that I had. Like one of my favorite jobs, in fact, I would, if the managers didn't have things in on time, I would start doing it for them. And my boss would get mad and be like, why are you doing that for them? they're supposed to have it in. What you should be doing is contacting them and getting them to do it. And I'm like, it's just easier if I do it myself. So I kept taking responsibility for things that weren't mine. And so I think even as an adult, I do it without even thinking, because it's just my reflex now. And so it takes me a lot to be able to recognize that, okay, this isn't my responsibility. And it is my responsibility to get them motivated to do what they need to do and not just let them slide. Right. And so that's been a shift for me. And I think for me, that's been difficult to shift, because when you grow up with something and it's always there, it's hard to shift out of that. And I think for me, the only time that I shift out of it is when it comes to my husband, which is really weird, but we'll talk more about that when we get into the blaming part. But that's basically all I have to say about that right now.
Yeah, I do identify with what you're saying, because I have brought this mindset into my adulthood, into my parenting, into my relationship with my husband. And I noticed it very significantly in my relationship with my children is for years. And I've started making corrections on this, but for so many years, because I had this sense of responsibility that everyone's happiness, everything was dependent on me, I realized that I was not teaching my kids about responsibility, how to take ownership over stuff that they need to be in charge of. And I would do everything for my kids. And to the point where, they weren't learning basic life skills, how to manage their own time, because I was just taking it all on myself. And since then, I have realized how detrimental that is to them. And I've since then, been teaching them, no, that's not my responsibility. And sometimes I get quite a bit of pushback, because, obviously this is something that I have done for years. And now that I've come to this understanding and revelation that no, so much of what I have done for my kids has been for their disservice. Like now it's like, okay, no, you need to learn how to be, a teenager. And a lot of them are growing into adulthood now. And it's like, they need to create their own sense of identity and their own sense of responsibility in terms of, household chores, even responsibility around getting things into the classroom on time, and even in regards to, a child not managing their time wisely and end up leaving their band instrument at home or all their homework at home. Like I would drop everything and I would like deliver it to the school. But the thing is that I would put my life on hold to accommodate their mistakes. And it's like I had to come to the point where, no, you screwed up. So you need to face the consequence of whatever consequence your teacher wants to give you, because you didn't follow through and you didn't think these things through. And so they're hard lessons to learn, but they're ones that, had I known this and had I recognized it earlier in life, they could have learned some of these skills much earlier. But I mean, nonetheless, they're learning them now. It's a little uncomfortable sometimes. And even as I'm doing some things, I'm like, wait a minute, why am I doing this? This is not my responsibility. You go do your own laundry, right? Like, but that was just a sense of, something that I had in my mind as a belief pattern for so many years. And how freeing it was for me to be able to come to this understanding of, nope, these are not my responsibility. Like, just felt like this huge burden came off my shoulders, because I finally am recognizing what I am responsible for. And I'm choosing to take that responsibility and let everything else go, and let everyone else start facing the consequences of their actions, their words, and their thoughts. And so I would like to bring up this chart that I found online many, many years ago. It helped me kind of come to this point of discovery. And it's the chart of responsibility. And you who are listening, you probably have seen it or heard about it, but it's such a wonderful visual representation of what we are responsible for and what we aren't. And I'm just going to read out what it says. So there's many different versions of this online. You can search it up on Google or whatever your search engine is, and just say, chart of responsibility or but yeah, the one I'm looking at, it has an inner circle, and it says, this is my responsibility. So I am responsible for my words, my behavior, my actions, my efforts, my mistakes, my ideas, and the consequences of my actions. And then there's an outer circle, and this one says, this is not my responsibility. So I am not responsible for other people's ideas, other people's opinions, other people's actions, the consequences of people's actions, other people's words, other people's mistakes, or other people's beliefs. And so when we can see this clear delineation, like this clear separation between what is my responsibility and what is someone else's responsibility, it helps us when we're in challenging situations, when we're even in conflict situations. And I absolutely love this chart. I have it up in my home, and it's just a visual representation of, where you cross, like where you draw that line, like I called it in our webinar, that dividing line. It's that clear separation point where I and someone else begins.
Yeah, I find it interesting too that sometimes, like I said, there's usually two, like if you're not in the self-regulating mode where you are perfectly aligned and you only take responsibility for your things, and there's two other reactions that you have, right? Like you're either blaming others or you take everything on yourself, kind of like what we did. And so, like for me, earlier I kind of touched on it, but in my relationship with Walter, I find that there are times when like we've had rough communication and I'm always like, why can't you communicate better? And I immediately put that on him instead of taking responsibility for my own issues with communication. And I've been reading this book lately that's actually really been helping me see where I've been like wrong in my communication, or not even wrong, but just off. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And just even in my perception of how I'm supposed to be communicating with him and why he communicates the way that he does, because he's not me, right? He's himself, and I have to treat him that way. And the more that I've been realizing that men communicate differently than women and been actually respecting that, we've had way better communication. And like now we want to talk for long periods of time and discuss things and explore things together. And before it was just like, oh, do we really want to talk about anything? Because we almost always end up in a fight. And I can understand why he wouldn't want to talk to me if he's constantly feeling like I'm blaming him for every communication issue we're having. Like, who wants to be a part of that? Whereas now I'm taking responsibility. I've improved my own communication and I've seen the difference. And so just by taking that responsibility for my actions and the way that I speak, so my words, just like the thing says, all of a sudden things have shifted. Oh, goodness, how well this works.
Yeah. Well, I like when I think of it in terms of conflict,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because let's say I'm having a conflict with my husband, and like you said, the communication goes south, right? And all of a sudden now it's blown up into this big issue, and you know, we're both frustrated, we're both angry, we're both like feeling unheard. And sometimes I have to walk away from that situation and think, okay, especially when there's been a reaction, especially when he's reacted in a certain way, right? And so I have to actually take a step back, and I actually have this mental dialogue that I go through, and it's like, okay, Laura, replay the whole situation in your head. what parts were you responsible for, right? So like I was responsible for every word I spoke. Okay, so what were the words that I spoke?
Right.
Were they helpful? Were they offensive? Like was I mean and rude and dishonoring, right? Like I got to literally look at what was it that I said, right? And then it's like, well, what was my behavior? How was I behaving towards him? Right? And then it's like, okay, maybe I was being extremely frustrated and showing that outwardly, or and then the other one is like in my actions, right? Like what were my actions in that situation? And so when I can step back and actually take an objective look at my part, like what role did I play in this conflict? And sometimes I clearly see, oh my gosh, like I so derailed that. I made that go to the pit so fast. And I go back and I apologize to my husband and I say, you know what? You so didn't need that. I was frustrated about something else and I took it out on you and I'm sorry. But then there's other times where I do that mental evaluation and I'm like, no, I spoke truth in a loving way. I was kind, remained calm. I didn't lose my temper, like, even when he was reacting, I was calm or whatnot, and there's times where I can be like, "You know what? I did everything okay, and I did everything right." So, at that point, I have to tell myself, "This isn't my issue."
Mhm.
Right? He's got stuff going on inside of him, in his mind, in his life, that he's being frustrated or triggered by whatever, but I can't take the responsibility of him, his actions and his response and his behavior because I've actually looked at my part of the problem and I'm like, okay, I did everything I could have done in the most beneficial and positive way. So I just need to let him be, right? And so those times I just, I don't bring it up again. I don't like um rehash it and say, how dare you respond like that or anything like that. I just let it go. And then I let him in his own quiet time and just kind of deal with his own thoughts and his emotions, and it settles itself out, and we usually can have a conversation about it otherwise. But my whole point in that is that sometimes in conflict or in difficult situations like that, you're gonna have to just step back and take
Mhm.
an honest, clear evaluation. Okay, what did I actually say? What did I actually do? How was I actually behaving? Like, and taking an actual like note about how those things impact other people, right? Because I am responsible for my part. I'm not responsible for other people's parts. And so realizing, like I said, where I end and someone else begins is a huge skill to learn. And it's a skill. Like it's something that we actually have to train ourselves to do because I would say in most people's lives this has not been something that has been well taught
Mhm.
or even modeled,
That's
at
true.
least in the lives of the people that I see. Very rarely do I see someone who can do this effectively right away. Like they've worked on it. It's been something that they've put into practice for quite some time and they've developed these skills. And so if you find that you're in a place where, you're either on either side of that spectrum, you're always taking responsibility for everything, even other people's emotions, behaviors, and words, or you just deflect all of the responsibility onto someone else and think that they're the problem and you have no part in it, then I think there's room for improvement. I think there's maybe some time where you should step back and start taking some more objective evaluation of what's actually going on and what part do I play in this situation.
I agree. I've even had like a conflict come up recently where I looked back, saw where my responsibility was and the responsibility of the other person. And it just so happened that they were unwilling to take their responsibility. So I had to put up a boundary.
Right.
So There's cases like that too, where they don't want to take their responsibility either. And so to protect yourself, you may have to do the same.
Right.
As hard as that is.
But in doing so, like by you recognizing that and you doing that, that's going to create more opportunity for that person to recognize that maybe they did have a part to play. It might take them a little more time, but they'll be like, you know what? This person doesn't want to be in relationship with me, or they've put very strong boundaries on what that relationship can look like. And it's like, it's going to cause them to have to look at themselves and what role they played in that situation in your life. So
Sure.
that's very important to recognize that need, that if someone isn't recognizing it within themselves, that you do need to put up those boundaries. Another scripture that I wanted to bring up. So for those of you that are listening and you love the Bible and you love reading scripture, this one I just really felt was very applicable to what we're talking about today. And it's Romans 14:12-13. So then each of us will give an account of himself to God. Therefore, let us stop passing judgment on one another. Instead, make up your own mind not to put any stumbling block or obstacle in your brother's way. And I really wanted to bring this up just simply to say, like, we are accountable to God. And so a lot of times we want to judge other people or judge them for where they're at. And I know I do this myself, especially when I feel like I'm getting a little more successful in one area. Then I start looking down on other people and just recognizing that in myself. I just wanted to bring that up today because, you know, if we are finding more success in this area and we are finding our way in this area of responsibility, it's important that we don't start passing judgment on other people because they are on their own journey. They're in their own place. They have to go through this same level of discovery. But in doing so, the second part of the scripture says, but make up your mind not to put any stumbling block in their way, right? So even though they're maybe not where you're at, be mindful of where they are and, you know, choose not to create any situation in their life that's going to make it harder for them to have this kind of discovery. Connie, do you have any final thoughts or things you want to share before we close up for today?
I think just that we need to be mindful in our communication with people. We have to be mindful in our relationships. Just of this fact, because I think sometimes we do get into that judgment cycle when we're in communication with people, and sometimes like we don't even say it to them, but we're thinking it, and then it causes distance between us and them. And sometimes it's not even necessary distance because that's between them and God. And, you know, we're called to pray for them. We're called to, you know, care for them and encourage them forward. And so I think sometimes we just need to find out what we can do in those situations to encourage them forward. Right?
Right. Yeah.
Because even when I drew the boundary, I still let them know that I loved them, but this was a boundary I had to place. And so they knew in that I hadn't completely withdrawn relationship, but I couldn't keep going the way things were.
Right. Well, that's such a huge lesson to learn, Connie. And I knowing what happened in your life in that situation, I can see that you're operating from a greater level of peace and just self-confidence, even like you know where your line is drawn, and that's just where it is, right? Just matter of fact. Well, thank you all for joining us today. I just want to close with a quote. And it says this: accept responsibility for your actions, be accountable for your results, and take ownership of your mistakes. And if we do that, then I think we're good to go. We'll be on the right path, and we'll be more readily able to take responsibility for our part in any given situation and leave the rest up to the other people involved. So have a blessed week, and we'll see you next time on the NOSA Unleashed podcast. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in. Join us next time on the NOSA Unleashed podcast.